Great. So again, welcome to this February presentation by the Olympia World Affairs Council. Tonight, we are hearing from Professor Seth Weinberger from the Department of Politics and Government at the University of Puget Sound. And his topic tonight is Whither, the Iran Nuclear Deal. So for a bit of background on what he'll be speaking about tonight, I want to share with you his words from the flyer. In May 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran Nuclear Deal, despite twice having certified Iran as being in compliance with the agreement and imposed economic sanctions in an effort to alter Iran's behavior. Since then, Iran has increased its stocks of enriched uranium and is currently closer than ever to a nuclear bomb. President Joe Biden announced his intention to have the US re-enter the agreement, but to date, negotiations have been stalled. Was the Iran deal working? Why didn't the maximum pressure campaign of President Trump work? Should the US re-enter the deal? So, Joe, you can enjoy this conversation today with Professor Seth Weinberger, who is going to analyze and discuss the future of the Iran nuclear deal. So welcome, Seth.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all very much for having me, and especially thank you all for coming to listen to me. I'm sure you all have equally exciting other things to do, and I appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to me talk about things that I care about, nuclear weapons and possibility for war. So as Amy said, I am going to discuss sort of where things are at the moment. That blurb was written a little while ago, so it's no longer quite accurate to say negotiations are stalled. It was at the time that I wrote that, but negotiations are now ongoing. They are actually happening right now in Vienna. So what I'm going to do tonight is talk a little bit about the history of US-Iranian relations, the history of Iran's nuclear program, the negotiations surrounding the creation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is also known as the Iran nuclear deal, President Trump's decision to exit that deal, and then where things are now, and sort of my assessment of where things might go as these negotiations are going on right now. And so that's sort of what I'll be talking about tonight. As Amy mentioned, I'm happy to answer clarifying questions during my talk. If you have questions about technologies that I mention or the history or things like that, as opposed to sort of substantive questions, feel free to ask those in the moment, and I will try to answer them as they come in. Because not everyone is as familiar with the history or the technical details of nuclear weapons and proliferation and things as am I. So I am happy to help you out in the moment. So I'm not exactly sure how long I'll be talking for, but my goal is to not talk for too long and rather leave time open for questions. And so you all can ask, give you plenty of time to ask whatever questions you have. I'm not sure if John was kidding, but he also asked me to, you said that there might be questions about what's going on in Ukraine. And so while I'm not going to talk about Ukraine, I'm certainly happy once we get to the end of my prepared remarks. If people have questions about what's going on in Ukraine, I'm happy to address those as well. I'm not, whether or not John was serious, I'm happy to do that. So let's go ahead. So after World War II, Iran was something close to a democracy, not necessarily a liberal democracy in the way that we think about Western European states or Japan or places like that, but it was something close to a democracy. And in 1952, 1953, Iran elected a president by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh. And Mossadegh, as many people, as many former colonized states at the time, Mossadegh was looking to shake off sort of the former yoke of colonialism and to try to build a modern economic state. And Mossadegh, President Mossadegh was talking about nationalizing international foreign oil companies. So nationalizing oil companies is when a country basically takes over foreign companies that are doing business inside their country and says, we own these now. And this is actually legal under international law. There are rules about how you compensate companies. But there were fears that Mossadegh was going to nationalize the oil industries. And this is coming at the sort of the early days of the Cold War. And so there were fears that this meant he was a socialist or a communist, someone who was not in favor of sort of free enterprise capitalistic business. And so the United States, through the CIA, sponsored a coup that overthrew Mossadegh and installed the Shah of Iran, who was a dynastic leader, family-based ruler. And the Shah then ruled Iran for the rest of until 1979. The Shah was a brutal authoritarian who brutally suppressed domestic dissent, political protests, and did not allow elections and things like that. The Shah's rule came to an end in 1979. I'm speeding up, right? I'm not going to spend too long on this part. With the Islamic Revolution, when Islamic militants, sort of inspired by Ayatollah Khomeini, overthrew the Shah and took control of Iran and turned it into an Islamic republic. And that's really where the problems start with Iran. They were very bitter that the United States had overthrown Mossadegh and had supported the Shah. The United States, the Shah then gets thrown out of the country. President Jimmy Carter allows the Shah to come to the United States for cancer treatments. He was sick. This then led to the Iran hostage crisis, where militants seized the United States embassy and held hostages for over 400 days. With the installation of an Islamic theocratic regime, Iran becomes a revolutionary state. It seeks to export its brand of religion. Iran is a Shia country. You may be aware that there are two primary sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia. Sunni is by far the dominant majority. Most of the states that we think of, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, these are Sunni states, but Iran is a Shia state. Iran is also not an Arab state, they are Persian. And so Iran adopts this sort of revolutionary ideology, seeking to export its foreign policy and its Shia religion, and adopts a very aggressive role in the region that leads to conflicts with countries like Iraq, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Iran's nuclear program goes back into the 1950s, actually begins under the Shah with cooperation from the United States, although it doesn't go very far. The United States is nervous and is not as interested in helping states develop nuclear power, but not in developing nuclear weapons technology. And there are routes by which countries can develop nuclear power without having the possibility of then weaponizing that and turning that into a bomb. And so the United States was helping Iran, develop a nuclear power industry, but that didn't go very far. And in 1979, when the revolutionary government takes over, the revolutionary government actually freezes the nuclear program and stops it. In 1985, uranium is discovered in Iran, and it begins to set the ground for the clerics, the rulers of Iran, to discuss whether or not they need and should develop nuclear weapons to counter Israel. Israel develops nuclear weapons in the 1960s. In the early 1990s, Iran gets assistance from Russia and China and begins to build nuclear reactors. In December of 2002, the United States, for the first time, accuses Iran of trying to build nuclear weapons. And at that point, negotiations begin over the future of the Iranian nuclear program. In 2004, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is an arm of the United Nations whose job it is to monitor nuclear technology and proliferation around the world, the IAEA calls on Iran to suspend uranium enrichment. Iran continues to do so, but announces that it would, if certain conditions are met, negotiate suspension of enrichment. But even back in 2004, Iran announces that it is every state's inherent sovereign right to enrich uranium, and that while Iran has no intention of developing a nuclear weapon, it will never give up its right to enrich. So basically, Iran says, we'll negotiate a suspension of enrichment if you give us the right sort of incentives, but we will never give up the right to enrich Iran. So even to enrich uranium. So even going back to 2004, Iran sees sort of the right to enrich uranium as a fundamental component of its state sovereignty, which states take very seriously. In August of 2005, Ayatollah Khamenei, who has replaced Ayatollah Khamenei issues a fatwa, which is a declaration of Islamic law, issues a fatwa that the production, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons are forbidden under Islamic law. So now, in theory, that fatwa could be revoked at any time, but in theory, if a fatwa is in place, then that is binding law in an Islamic society. So as of August 2005, we have a declaration that the production, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons are forbidden. So throughout this period, basically throughout the early middle part of the 2000s, there are international inspections going on as Iran is negotiating sort of whether or not to suspend its uranium enrichment. And the inspections suggest that Iran is in compliance with international law and various regulations that have been put in place, but imperfect information means that it is impossible to know for sure, right? And this is the same time, of course, that the United States' information about chemical weapons in Iraq is proving to be so erroneous, right? So it's really hard to know what's going inside these countries. It's easy to hide things. It's easy to move things around. So unless you really have sort of a comprehensive inspections regime with full compliance from the country, it's really hard to know if a country is in fact doing what it's supposed to be doing, whether or not it's complying with its agreements. Okay. In April of 2006, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad announces that Iran has succeeded in enriching uranium to reactor grade level. So uranium is a little bit of a complex. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but basically uranium exists. The way that most uranium exists is uranium isotope 238. Uranium isotope 238 cannot be used for nuclear reactions. It doesn't spontaneously create chain reactions that you need either for nuclear energy or for a nuclear bomb. So what you have to do, uranium is like 99% uranium 238, but it's only 1% uranium 235, which is the kind of uranium that you actually want. So you have to enrich your uranium to get it to be larger concentrations of uranium 235. And you do that by spinning it in a centrifuge. A centrifuge is a huge device that spins around and uses centrifugal force to separate heavier and lighter elements. So basically the 238 is heavier than the 235, so they separate and you can isolate the 235, and you keep doing this and doing this and doing this until you have until your uranium has enough 235 and you've gotten rid of the 238. So in April 2006, the Iranian president announces that Iran has enriched uranium to reactor grade levels, and it has done this through centrifuges, and therefore Iran should be considered a nuclear state. Now, it's important here to keep in mind, this is actually something I was just talking about in class earlier today. The basic physics of nuclear technology is actually really, really quite simple. It's just basically addition and then some basic conceptualizations. There's nothing sort of scientifically complicated about nuclear energy or even building a nuclear bomb. It's actually the technical aspects of doing the things you need to do and putting the bomb together. So it's not the science, it's actually the engineering that's really difficult. And fortunately, it's so difficult that it's still, even today, decades after the United States and the Soviet Union and China have been able to build nuclear weapons, even today, it's still really hard for states to do this. It still takes them decades, years and years, decades, and billions of dollars to be able to produce nuclear weapons, right? So each stage sort of along that is an important milestone because it means you're getting closer to mastering the technical aspects. Again, it's not the science, it's the technical. So in April 2006, when Iran successfully enriches uranium to reactor grade, that is an important sort of milestone because it means now they're pretty close to being able to put together enough material to actually build a bomb. And in December 2006, the UN Security Council imposes sanctions on Iran for its enrichment, which is a violation of international law. In 2007, Iranian scientists, nuclear scientists, start to be killed mysteriously. they get shot, they get run over, they get blown up, and Israel is suspected to be behind this, but nobody knows for sure. In December 2007, the United States intelligence community releases a report that Iran had actually stopped its weapons program in 2003, but had continued to enrich uranium to produce nuclear fuel. Right, and so it's not right. So at this point, so this is sort of coming to the end of the 2000 decade. It's not really clear what's going on. Iran is enriching uranium. There is some reports from the intelligence community that they're not working on a weapon, but nobody really knows because it's, as I've mentioned, it's very hard to know what's actually happening. In 2009 and 2010, your enrichment at one of the primary Iranian facilities is disrupted. And it turns out that a computer virus known as Stuxnet was introduced into the Iranian enrichment facilities that successfully destroyed many of those centrifuges that I was talking about. The virus was created and deployed by the United States and Israel, right? So what we have here, Iran is developing this enrichment program. The US and Israel are attacking it in various ways, killing Iranian scientists, disrupting Iranian technical processes. In 2012, the IAEA confirms that Iran can enrich to 20%. Now, for a weapon, you normally want your uranium to be at least 85 to 90%, but enrichment doesn't work arithmetically. It's much harder to get from regular uranium to 20% than it is to get to from 20% to 90%, right? So once you've mastered the technology to enrich uranium to 20%, that's basically the ball game. Now it's just a matter of doing it, but it's much easier to get to the weapons grade from 20% than to get to 20% in the first place. So in 2012, the international community announces that Iran can basically enrich uranium to weapons grade if it so desires. That is essentially when the Obama administration begins negotiating the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In 2013, the United States begins secret negotiations with Iran, and in November of 2013, the interim Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is announced. And this deal has been negotiated between Iran, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which are the United States, Russia, China, France, and Great Britain, and then Germany. And so if you read articles about this, you'll sometimes see that referred to as the P5+1, the permanent 5+1. So they announce an interim deal, but they keep negotiating. It's not quite there yet. And in 2014, throughout 2014, they're negotiating this. And in 2015, the parties announced that they have settled on an agreement. The JCPOA is announced and it is signed and enters into effect in July 2015. Okay, so what's in the JCPOA? What is the Iran nuclear deal? According to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran will limit its centrifuges it will reduce the number of operating centrifuges from 19,138 to 6,104. Doesn't matter what that number means. It just means that it's much harder to enrich uranium because you have a third fewer centrifuges. Those centrifuges, furthermore, are not capable of enriching beyond approximately 6 to 8%. So those centrifuges cannot produce weapons grade uranium. Iran agrees to reduce its advanced centrifuges, which you would use to get from 20% all the way up to weapons grade, from 1008 to 0. So Iran basically is going to give up the ability to enrich uranium to weapons grade. It accepts limitations on its ability to research and develop new centrifuge technology. It agrees to reduce its stockpile of low enriched uranium. So low enriched uranium would be anything below 20%. From 7,154 kilograms to 300 kilograms, and it agrees to reduce its medium enriched uranium from 196 kilograms to 0. Iran agrees to only enrich uranium to 3.67%, which is enough to fuel a nuclear reactor, but not even close to weapons grade. Again, you've got to get to that 20% before you've sort of hit that threshold where then it becomes easy to get to weapons grade. So basically, through all these agreements, the reductions in centrifuges, the reductions in stockpiles of enriched uranium, and the limitations on enriching, the breakout time, and so the breakout time is something that you'll hear people refer to. That refers to the time that if Iran says, okay, as of today, we want to have enough fissile uranium for a bomb, how long does it take to actually do that? So breakout time is from the moment you decide to start enriching up to weapons grade. How long does it take? Prior to the JCPOA, Iranian breakout time was estimated to be 2 to 3 months, and most analysts believe that the JCPOA would extend Iranian breakout time to a year. Okay. The limitations of the JCPOA are going to be in place for between 10 to 15 years. Different ones have different lengths of time. But basically, the deal is basically in place for about 15 years. And after 15 years, the JCPOA would expire and Iran could go about doing whatever it wanted to do. Okay. So that's Iran's side of the agreement. The P5+1 agreed to end or suspend economic sanctions that had been placed on Iran for its nuclear program and to release $100 billion of frozen assets. So you might remember under the Obama administration, there was all this hubbub about piles of money being given to Iran. This is that money, right? At various times throughout the relationship between the United States and Iran, the United States had frozen Iranian assets for various reasons. So what that means is that Iran would have money in banks in the United States, and the US government would take that money and freeze it and put it where Iran couldn't get it. And so the United States, as well as other countries, were agreeing to release that money to give it back to Iran. The United States was allowed to maintain sanctions for ballistic missiles for 8 years. So it could punish Iran for trying to develop missiles for another 8 years, and to maintain sanctions for conventional weapons for another 5 years. And U.S. sanctions that were placed on Iran for sponsoring terrorism or for human rights abuses were unaffected. So the U.S. was only lifting sanctions related to things that were put on Iran to punish it for its nuclear activity, not anything else it was doing. Furthermore, a dispute resolution mechanism was created whereby if one party believed that another party was in violation of the deal, they could go file a dispute. There was a mechanism by which that dispute would be resolved. And if Iran was found to be in violation, the P5+1 countries were allowed to put those sanctions back in place. Okay, so we get this deal. President Obama decides to join the JCPOA, but he does not do it as a treaty because it would not pass the Senate. And so it is created as an executive agreement. And all that means is basically that it's not binding law. President Obama said the United States will abide by this, but as we know, President Trump, because it's just an executive agreement, is completely within his rights to say, I am not going to abide by this. And so that's eventually what happens. So the agreement is never submitted to the Senate as a law, as a treaty to become actually binding law. Public opinion in the United States about whether or not this is a good thing is severely divided. In favor of the agreement, there was a bipartisan letter from more than 100 former US ambassadors and high-ranking State Department officials, 5 former ambassadors to Israel from both the Republican and the Democratic Party, 60 national security leaders from both parties, including 2 former national security advisors, 29 prominent nuclear physicists, 36 retired generals and admirals, 75 arms control and nonproliferation experts. So pretty good range of people across the political spectrum, across national security and scientific communities, arguing that this deal is a good agreement and that the United States this is a good deal for the United States. On the other side, against the agreement, the primary thing that was against the agreement was a letter from 200 retired generals and admirals. So I guess they win in terms of numbers, but they have 200 retired generals and admirals who argue that this is a bad agreement. Most of the rest of the opposition is primarily political. And so what I mean by political is people who have sort of skin in the game. Israel is really opposed to it. Saudi Arabia is really opposed to it. Republicans are opposed to it for various reasons. And I don't mean to imply that those aren't legitimate reasons. They're more political than they are about the nature of the deal itself. And I'm happy to explain that in questions if people are interested. Let me outline the arguments for and against. There are 3 main arguments that the Iran nuclear deal was a bad agreement. The first argument is that the fact that the deal expired 10 to 15 years after it initially went into place means that for Iran, this is just a waiting game. that at best you're going to get 10 or 15 years, and Iran is free to continue to do certain kinds of research during that period, but eventually the deal is going to disappear and Iran is free to go back and develop nuclear weapons, right? So you've given Iran sanctions relief, you've released that $100 billion, and all you've gotten is 10 or 15 years, right? Not a great deal. The second argument is that it will be impossible to verify the deal, that Iran is not going to cooperate with international inspections, and that once you have the deal, you're not going to be willing to blow it up over sort of minor ticky-tack little violations, right? So if you show up at a facility and Iran won't let you in, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to put the sanctions back on? Because if you put the sanctions back on, then Iran's going to back out of the deal. So the argument is here that the way that the verification mechanism works is not going to punish Iran for all sorts of little violations that it's going to be able to get away with, which will actually enable it to cheat and continue to enrich uranium, for example. And so, right, the fear that Iran will be able to break the deal without repercussions. And then the third main argument, I think, is that the agreement is only really about Iranian nuclear enrichment. It doesn't address all sorts of other things that are seen as problematic about Iranian behavior. Iran's support of terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Iran's support of militia groups that are fighting against Israel or Saudi Arabia, right? So if you're following the news, you might be aware that there's a big, long-standing conflict going on in Yemen. One of the parties in Yemen who are trying to take over the government, the Houthi rebels, are funded by Iran. And so that the failure to address Iran's other behaviors, its support of terrorist organizations, support of militias, its ballistic missiles, that if you don't deal with those things and you lift sanctions and you give Iran this pile of cash, you're going to have an empowered and more disruptive Iran with tons of money, being able to do all sorts of things even without developing nuclear weapons. All right, so the arguments in favor of the deal, the first and maybe the strongest argument is that it's probably the best thing you're going to get. It's completely unclear what other options are available. Most people believe that the only way to really stop the Iranian nuclear program would be a full-scale invasion, that trying to blow it up from airstrikes would probably be impossible. The sanction regime that was in place was falling apart. The European countries wanted to do business with Iran. They were getting frustrated with the inability to sell goods to Iran and to buy Iranian oil. And furthermore, it's important to remember that when you're negotiating within the country, that country has a say in the outcome, right? So you can't just say, here's the final outcome that we prefer, and this is the only deal. You're negotiating. So it's not clear that Iran would agree to anything really significantly more extensive than it got. The deal did create the most intrusive monitoring and inspection regime that the international community has ever seen on a country. It was the first time a state willingly agreed to extensive monitoring. Normally, countries only agree to that kind of monitoring when they're defeated in a war, like Iraq after both the 1991 Gulf War and the eventually the 2003 invasion, right? And the other argument, I think, finally, is that yes, it's only 10 or 15 years, but a lot can happen in 10 or 15 years, right? So if you kick the can down the road, if you push the Iranian nuclear program 15 years out, well, who knows? New technologies, maybe the Iranian Islamic regime is overthrown. All sorts of things can happen. And so even buying time is a valuable strategy, right? 15 years is a pretty significant time. Okay, so those are the agreements for and against. Right. So the agreement goes into place between 2015 and 2017. There are minor violations, mostly stuff like not being let into a facility at the right time or things like this. But everybody agrees there is no evidence that Iran is out of compliance. Nobody has any evidence that Iran is breaking the deal, and nobody really even claims that they are. And so according to the deal, the US and the other P5+1 members, every 3 months, every 90 days, are certifying that Iran is in compliance, and that is continuing. And that continues throughout the Obama administration. It even continues into the Trump administration. Right? So Trump becomes president in 2018. Both candidate and President Trump expressed their dismay at the Iran nuclear deal, maybe to put it simply. President Trump referred to the nuclear deal as a disaster, the worst deal ever, and called it so terrible that it could lead to a nuclear holocaust. However, throughout 2017, under the Trump administration, the United States continues to certify, 2018, that Iran is in compliance. In 2017, 2017, I did mean 2017. In 2017, October, Trump refuses to certify that Iran is in compliance, but he doesn't claim that Iran isn't complying. He just doesn't want to certify that Iran is in compliance, and they clearly were. In May of 2018, and so then after that, so between October 2017 and May 2018, the United States again does certify that Iran is in compliance until May of 2018. In May of 2018, President Trump announces that the deal is over, that the United States is going to withdraw from the JCPOA, and his arguments justifying it is that that by lifting the sanctions, Iran was given too much money to continue its sponsorship of terrorism and to pursue its regional agenda. That he is going to impose maximum pressure, which is his term, maximum pressure on Iran to get a better deal, right? We know that Trump is often obsessed with getting better deals. And so he argues that he's going to get a better deal by withdrawing, putting massive economic pressure on Iran, and getting a better agreement out of Iran. His withdrawal is supported by countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, and Israel. But it is opposed by the UN, the European Union, China, France, Great Britain, Portugal, Spain, Russia, Jordan, Australia, Italy, Japan, Turkey, Ireland, Netherlands, New Zealand. It's not a very popular move. After the United States announces its withdrawal, Iran announces that it will stay in compliance with the deal for the meantime, hoping that the United States will return. But in May of 2019, the US hasn't come back, and Iran begins to suspend compliance. July 2019, Iran announces that it will begin enriching past that 3.67 level that was agreed on in the JCPOA. In November 2019, Iran reactivates its centrifuges. Remember, they had gone down from 18,000 to 5,000. So they go from 5,000 to 10,000, and they begin to enrich to 5%. At that point, the United States begins to reimpose sanctions, claiming it is a participant in the agreement, that it actually didn't abrogate the agreement, it just withdrew from the agreement, and tries to get the UN to reimpose sanctions. At that point, the US is basically laughed out of the UN. Then the United States and Israel begin killing Iranian nuclear physicists again. There's a sabotage incident at the primary enrichment facility, right? So the United States and Israel have sort of gone back to the way things were before the JCPOA, killing Iranian scientists, trying to sabotage Iranian facilities, but it is not working. In January 2021, right as President Biden is about to be sworn in, Iran announces that it has begun to enrich towards 20%. Again, remember that's the critical threshold. President Biden gets sworn in at the end of January, and in November 2021, talks begin for the United States to re-enter the agreement. So that's sort of where we are now. Quickly, I'm going to summarize sort of where things are and what's going forward, and then I'm happy to take questions. So right now, the United States is in a much, much, much worse position than it was when the JCPOA was created. Everybody, from analysts to members of the Biden administration, believe that at this point, the best deal the United States can get is one that would leave Iran with a breakout time closer to 3 to 4 months. Right. That now Iran has already begun enriching uranium. They've already got uranium up to that 20% threshold. They're not going to give that up. And so the best you can hope for now is to get something that caps the program where it is and brings that breakout time back down around 3 or 4 months. Remember, it was a year under the JCPOA. So one US official was quoted as saying, "We've concluded late last year that Iran's nuclear program has advanced too far to recreate the roughly 12-month so-called breakout period of the 2015 pact." Nobody really knows. It's possible that right now, without the JCPOA in place, that Iran's breakout time could be 3 weeks. Now, I want to be clear. That is only enough time. That's the time to get enough fissile material. Nobody thinks that Iran has the ability to make a warhead yet. So that would probably still be a year or two, but it would only, so As things are right now, Iran's breakout time might be 2 to 3 weeks. Under the JCPOA, it was a year, and people are hoping that maybe a new agreement could get it back to maybe 3 or 4 months. Iran is demanding, I think not unreasonably, that the United States promise not to withdraw. Problem is the US can't really promise that unless the agreement is a treaty, and the treaty has no chance of passing the Senate, which means that Iran is in a very strong position because the US can't meet one of its critical demands, and so is going to have to give it other things that Iran wants. It's because the US has demonstrated that it is an untrustworthy partner. You don't want to enter into an agreement and give things up if your partner is just going to withdraw, right? So for example, if President Trump or another Republican wins in 2024, right, and the deal goes away again, Iran is concerned about that. So Iran, their primary demand is that they want to wait until sanctions are lifted before reimposing uranium limits and inspection protocols. Iran is in a much, much stronger position now than it was for the first round of negotiations. Trump's decision, whether it was good or bad for the United States, has drastically undermined the US diplomatic credibility. The arms embargo that I mentioned earlier is about to expire. The missile embargo that has been placed expires next year, right? So not only is Iran in a stronger place with uranium, but a whole bunch of other sanctions are about to expire, and the international community is not going to put those back on if the U.S. remains outside of the deal, because that was sort of part of the package, right? So at this point, most analysts, even those who were initially opposed to the first JCPOA, now feel that so much ground has been lost by withdrawing that restarting the deal is probably the best option, even if it's not nearly as good a deal as it used to be. The deal wasn't perfect, but foreign policy is not about getting perfect. Foreign policy is not about getting the best option. Foreign policy is about choosing the least crappy option out of a range of crappy options, right? You don't get to choose the thing that's best for you. You have to choose the option that's best out of a whole range of options that are far from perfect. Furthermore, Iran has demonstrated a remarkable ability to absorb massive economic sanctions. Trump's economic sanctions were huge. They were significant, but it produced no discernible change in Iranian behavior. If anything, it incentivized Iran to move faster towards enrichment. Right? The more the United States threatens Iran and punishes Iran, the more Iran believes that obtaining nuclear weapons is the best way to defend itself. You can really see this in the views of a bunch of former Israeli government and security officials, all of whom opposed the initial deal and now regret leaving it. So for example, Yoel Guzansky, who's the former head of the Iran desk at the Israeli National Security Council, has said this: the nuclear deal was flawed, but at least it put a lid on Iran's advancement, which we don't have now. The former military advisor to the top Israeli general whose responsibility was Iran. Today, it's clear that maximum pressure did not yield its political objectives and may actually have accelerated Iranian nuclear progress. Iran now has the capability of producing enough fissile material for a nuclear bomb on 4 weeks' notice. The defense minister of Israel, who was opposed to the agreement at the time, as bad as that deal was, Trump's decision to withdraw from it was even worse. It was the major mistake of the last decade in Iranian policy. Israel's top military commander withdrawing from the deal was a net negative. It released Iran from all of its restrictions and brought its nuclear program to a much more advanced position. And so that's where we are now, basically. Everybody is basically regretting what President Trump did, but Iran is in a much stronger position and is in position to sort of control and shape the negotiations, because now it holds the cards. Everybody wants Iran to come back into this deal, but it's already gotten so far down the nuclear road that you're not going to be able to put it back into that box. Iran is demanding that all sanctions imposed under the Trump administration be lifted. The United States doesn't want to meet that. Iran is demanding that the rest of the $100 billion in frozen assets is released, and that oil exports are released. The United States doesn't want to do that. My guess is they're going to have to. Senate Republicans are threatening to undermine the deal if they're not given a role in oversight, but that's unlikely to happen. So, right now where we are is they're negotiating in Vienna. They seem to be expressing hopeful statements, but my guess is that what we're going to get is something that is very favorable to Iran. that puts uranium enrichment, both enrichment and stockpile limits back in place, but at a much higher level than they were before. I think if we can get down to a 4-month breakout window, that would be a significant victory. That's maybe achievable. Again, I mean, there are people who think that it's still a bad deal. Most of the people who, I'm happy to talk about sort of assessments. So let me stop there. And I'll happily take any and all questions about what it is that people think is bad about the deal, where it is now, why it all matters, or whatever questions you might have. So let me go ahead and stop there. I think I've talked for a long time, longer than I thought, but that's fine. I'll stop there and be happy to take your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Seth. As I mentioned earlier, please do feel free to put your questions in the chat box. I'll give you a little time to formulate some questions while I see if we have someone joining us by phone. If they have a question, of course, they can't use the chat box. So I invite our phone person who has raised their hand to speak up and share your question.
Please.
The U.S. deals with a lot of countries that have nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. The difference with Iran is that we believe that they would use it not as a not as a mutually assured destruction, not as a deterrence, but they would actually use it as an offensive weapon. So what is, if we end up with Iran with a nuclear weapon, we can deal with that, or is that the end all to be all? It's the deal and not the outcome. In other words, how do you feel about Iran using nuclear weapons, for example, against Israel, which is claimed to wipe off the face of the earth?
I don't believe that Iran would use nuclear weapons against Israel. I believe Israel has a pretty robust nuclear arsenal of its own. Israel has the ability to deliver nuclear weapons to Iran. So unless you believe that the Iranian regime is suicidal, and Israel also has submarines with missiles. So unless you believe that the Iranian regime is somehow suicidal, I don't think Iran is going to use nuclear weapons against Israel. Now, I will say, I'll give you the other position to that. Israel isn't so confident. I do want to say it's not because of the rhetoric, right? Nobody believes the rhetoric coming out of Iran that they're going to turn Israel into a sea of fire and stuff like that. That's just the way people talk in politics. Israel's concern is that Israel is a very small state, that it wouldn't take much to do essentially catastrophic damage to the state. And that it's possible that launch times could be so short that Israel might not have time to respond. Now, I can't dismiss that out of hand. Nobody can. I tend to think that is not. I don't think that's an accurate assessment, but that's what Israel thinks. I also think there's evidence that Israel doesn't really believe that. But that's right. It's important to remember that states are always doing what they believe it is best for their foreign policy. So regardless of whether or not Israel believes that Iran would use nuclear weapons against Israel, it is without a doubt better for Israel that Iran not have them at all, right? So I don't believe that Iran is going to use nuclear weapons against Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States should allow Iran to get them, right? If Iran gets nuclear weapons, it means that now Iran essentially has the ability to deter actors from attacking it, which could lead Iran to be more aggressive in the region. So expanded sponsorship of terrorism. So if you pay really close attention to what's been going on in Syria, Israel very often launches airstrikes into Syria, and what it's doing, it is hitting Hezbollah outfits. Hezbollah is a Lebanese-based political party that is sponsored by Iran, but whose primary mission is, or at least used to be, now its primary mission is something else, but used to be basically, to destroy Israel. And so Iran has been funneling weapons through Syria to Hezbollah, and Israel keeps hitting those. That might be harder to do if Iran has nuclear weapons, right? Iran in and of itself deters Israel, Israel deters Iran from doing certain things, but if Iran has nuclear weapons, it might be hard to do that. So I don't believe that Iran is going to use nuclear weapons any more than I believe any state is going to use nuclear weapons. I And most people, although not all, most people who study this believe that nuclear weapons actually create stability between states because they raise the cost of war so high that nobody's going to risk it. So that's my belief. But I do think that nuclear weapons by Iran could create a very messy situation because Iran, again, might do all this low-level stuff. So I hope that answered your question.
Great, thank you.
Was there any, so do you want me to go ahead and read these or?
No, it's all right. We just, typically I just read them out to you,
Sure,
and then you answer them. So,
Sure.
So the next question we have is, what is your opinion about Iran's relationship with Russia and Russia's role in the deal?
So Russia has been interesting. Russia has actually, I think, largely played a very beneficial role. So a while back, I should have looked this up. I don't remember exactly when. At one point, Russia was actually taking Iranian nuclear fuel out of the country and storing it. So a lot of that nuclear, remember I mentioned that Iranian stockpiles went way down. Russia actually took a lot of that because someone's got to take it. Russia had actually offered, Russia does not want Iran to have nuclear weapons any more than the United States or Israel does. Russia and Iran often have common interests, especially as they oppose the United States, but Russia and Iran are not allies, they're not friends. And Russia does not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. So Russia has actually been very cooperative, has played a very good role, and has been very, very useful in coming up with some interesting solutions, and often has actually put pressure on Iran to compromise.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, was there ever any evidence Iran was cheating up to the time Trump pulled out of the deal?
No, none. Again, there were minor violations, but of very, very sort of technical things, right? Like, again, like sort of failure to open up inspection sites at the right time. There were some things that I think got misinterpreted in the American media, but that were not significant violations. Nobody, not a single party, not even the Trump administration. The Trump administration produced not one single piece of evidence that Iran was violating the deal. Trump's claim was not that Iran was violating the deal. Trump's claim that justified withdrawal was twofold. One, that the deal wasn't a good enough deal and that he could get a better deal. And two, that the deal enabled Iran to do all this other shenanigans, but that those things weren't part of the deal, right? So basically, Trump was unhappy with the deal that President Obama negotiated, which fair enough, but no, there's no evidence, none that was presented to anybody that Iran was cheating.
Okay, thank you. What's the political calculus for Biden joining a less robust deal? Does he open himself up to a big political push from the Republicans?
Sort of, but ultimately not really. The basic fundamental truth is that the American voter doesn't really care about foreign policy very much. It's too complicated and it doesn't really affect people's lives sort of directly. So, I mean, yes, I mean, the Republicans will no doubt hammer him for, just like they hammered Obama for signing what they were going to call a bad deal, but American voters don't care. Foreign policy is almost never something that people vote on. I mean, sort of occasionally things like whether or not you're, soft on communism and things like that, but those aren't really about foreign policy. Those are sort of, just sort of things more about general behaviors. Foreign policy is just not something that local politicians care about and local voters care about. So, I mean, again, yes, you'll see the Republicans, I think, hammer him for it like they did Obama, but I don't think Obama suffered at all for that deal. And I don't think Biden will at all. I'm not, again, that right. Whether or not Biden if he runs, whether or not he wins presidency will hinge on other things, not on the Iran nuclear deal.
Okay. Great, thank you. The next question is, would Israel's Iron Dome system be effective against an Iranian missile?
No, because it's not designed to. So it's important to understand in the context of this question that there's a difference between rockets and missiles. A missile is something that uses a ballistic arc, right? So it goes up, it leaves the atmosphere, and then it comes back down. Those things, a missile travels at 15 times the speed of sound. Right now, no country, not even the United States, has the ability to intercept a ballistic missile. Nobody can do it. And if you can do it, you can only intercept one at a time. The Iron Dome is designed to intercept rockets, which are basically jets, their jet engines, right? So it's like a drone, or it's like a jet plane, right? And they generally fly. They can move around a little bit, but they generally fly straight like this, like a jet plane does. So Iron Dome is very, very effective against rockets and mortars and things like that. It cannot intercept missiles. What the American system that does intercept missiles, you might remember from the first Gulf War, was the Patriot system. And at the time of Operation Desert Storm back in 1991, people were all excited because the Patriot system had intercepted all these Iraqi Scud missiles. That all turned out to be not true. It didn't work at all. It was all lies. It didn't intercept anything. The missiles that Iraq was launching were very, very crude and ineffective. So right now there is no functional ability to intercept. And again, nobody has the ability to intercept ballistic missiles.
Interesting. Thank you. The next question is, what was Trump's real motivation in pulling out of the agreement?
I think there was evidence that he just simply hated Barack Obama and hated the things that he did and tried to undo them. So I think that's at least some of a motivation. I argued from the very, very beginning, even before Trump won, that when he was just a candidate, the most dangerous thing about him was that he had zero understanding of foreign policy, and that the people who were around him had zero understanding of foreign policy. At the beginning of his administration, he surrounded himself with relatively good people like General Mattis, John Kelly, who were professional security people who understood security, but all those people were eventually forced out of the administration. So if we want to move beyond sort of personal motivations, I guess the best interpretation would be that he really does believe that he is like the best negotiator in the world and that he can negotiate anything. And that he would simply withdraw from the deal and impose massive economic sanctions on Iran, and Iran would collapse and break down and come back crying for a better deal. But that in of itself really shows a complete misunderstanding of foreign policy. Sanctions almost never work. The only real example of significant economic sanctions working were the economic sanctions placed on South Africa. And those sanctions were almost literally the entire world, and they took decades to work, right? So thinking that the United States by itself could impose economic sanctions on Iran and in 2 to 3 years get that, it's just absurd. That's just, nobody who studies this stuff thinks that could possibly work. So I guess the best interpretation is that Trump simply thought that he could do this and get a better deal.
Yeah.
But again, those are my guesses. I don't really know. Nobody knows.
No, that's fair. Thanks. And I think I have our final question. Aside from Iran and Israel, are any other Middle Eastern states also seeking nuclear weapons?
That's actually a really interesting question. At the moment, the answer to that is no. However, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, then the answer would almost certainly be yes, because Saudi Arabia would probably try to get them. Now, that would be really complicated because the US would really, really not want Saudi Arabia to get them, and the US has significant leverage over Saudi Arabia. But it's a really interesting question. It's interesting because, of course, for a long time, the argument was that Israel's nuclear arsenal was really, really dangerous because it would lead to proliferation throughout the Middle East, and that didn't happen. Egypt has never really tried to get nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia has never tried to get nuclear weapons, and those are the countries that would most likely want them. Even Iran, right? I think if you look at Iran's nuclear program is almost certainly not about Israel. It's almost certainly about the United States, right? So if you go back in that time frame that I listed, Iran's nuclear program really takes off in 2002, right? Well, why would it take off in 2002? What has happened in the world in 2002? The United States has invaded Afghanistan and is about to invade Iraq. Well, where are Afghanistan and Iraq? They are on the eastern and western borders of Iran, right? So the Iranian nuclear program really gets kicked off, not because of Israel. Israel developed nuclear weapons back in the 60s. So if Iran was proliferating because of Israel, it would have started proliferating back in the 80s, right? As soon as the regime comes in. No, it waits until the United States has invaded both of Iran's neighbors And if you're Iran, that would be pretty scary, right? To have the United States invading its neighbors, basically saying, right? Remember, back in the time, Bush is saying, we can invade anybody we want to, axis of evil, all this stuff. So, Iran's proliferation. So what's interesting about this is that it shows that, states don't just proliferate because somebody else has them, right? And it also shows that the relationships in the Middle East are much more complicated than people think. Saudi Arabia and Israel, even though they're sort of historically seen as enemies, actually have a lot in common because they both have the common enemy of Saudi Arabia. And now, of course, this is out in the open. The Abraham Accords that President Trump helped broker. The relationships are actually pretty decent between Israel and some of these Arab countries, but none of them ever proliferated because they were worried about Israel. But if Iran got nuclear weapons, that would put significant pressure on Saudi Arabia, possibly Egypt. And so at that point, they might. I would add that at one point, Syria was seeking nuclear weapons. So the one thing I would say is that other countries have tried to get nuclear weapons. So back in the early 1980s, Iraq was developing a nuclear program, and then Israel blew up their nuclear reactor. And then in the late 1990s, Syria was building, or early 2000s, I'm trying to remember now, I can't when this exactly was. Syria was starting to build a nuclear reactor, and Israel blew that up. So, but no one else right now is trying to get them.
Okay, we do have one more question.
Oh, sure.
What is the basis of the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Is it fundamentally religious or other factors?
So, it's sort of, there's the obvious religious debate, right, between Shias and Sunnis. Shias are the minority. The Sunnis generally treat them very badly. They have a fundamental dispute about how Islam is to be understood and all these sorts of aspects of their religion. But political scientists like me don't think that that's really what it's about. We really think that most conflicts are about power and not about things like religion and ideology. And here's just one way to think about this, right? The Cold War ostensibly looked like it was capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism, right? And yet communist China ends up on the side of the United States against the Soviet Union. Why? Because China's right next to the Soviet Union. They're both very powerful. And so China is afraid of Russia, of the Soviet Union, even though they're both ideological, even though they both have similar ideologies, right? So, and of course, the United States is cooperating with all sorts of brutal dictators who aren't Democrats, right? Because they're not communists. So, political scientists tend to see conflict as about power. So Saudi Arabia and Iran are the two most powerful states in the region, not counting Israel, because Israel's a little bit different. But Saudi Arabia and Iran are the two most powerful countries, so it's natural that they would oppose each other like the US and the Soviet Union did. So the religious divide certainly doesn't help and exacerbates things, but I think the primary conflict is simply about two powerful states in competition with each other. Two powerful they're both oil producing states, of course, too. So right.
Well, that concludes our questions for tonight. Thank you so much. Oh, Tony raised his hand.
Happy to keep going, so please go ahead.
Well, let's see. Nope, Tony put his hand down.
Tony, you have a question? Nope.
Maybe not. Great.
I will ask. I was just applauding, but I will ask a question.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you were applauding. Very nice.
So there was an article just in the recent Foreign Affairs about Iran, basically saying that it is, it's a failed victory in their efforts in Yemen, Syria, etc., and that ultimately it will fall because the Iranian government is really failing at its ability to serve its own people. It is they have been completely overcome by their ideological purity and so forth. Do you tend to agree with that, or is this kind of the wishful thinking that we've seen about many regimes that have been antithetical to the United States, and we always kind of think, well, ultimately they'll fall because the people will push back?
Well, that's happened sometimes and it hasn't happened other times. I think one of the things that matters is whether or not the regime can provide economic well-being, right? So, for a long time, people were expecting that China was going to sort of become some kind of moderate, quasi-democratic capitalist society. And that hasn't happened. If anything, China's gotten worse on the authoritarian front, but that's because China has been able to provide massive economic benefits to the people. And, people are happy, if they're fed and they have if you have a good future for your kids, you will take all sorts of political indignities. Iran is incapable of providing that, right? The Iranian economy is a disaster. Now, I wouldn't want to predict that I wouldn't give you a time frame on that. What I would say, though, is, again, that's an argument in favor of sort of kicking the can down the road, right? Again, that if you can buy 15 years, in 15 years, maybe the Iranian regime does collapse, right? It is massively unpopular. The mullahs have not been able to provide any kind of significant economic development. They have not been able to provide any kind of sort of stable civil society. And what's really important to understand, I think, and particularly about Iran, is that the Iranian people, are a very kind of cosmopolitan people, right? They're not really interested, right? They're not like Saudis, right? They don't want to live an ascetic religious lifestyle. That is forced on them. And so, the regime, again, I don't study Iran as a country, so I'm not going to try to make any predictions about how long I think the regime is going to last, or put a probability on the fact, put a probability on whether or not it's going to. I will say, though, that it's an argument in favor of kicking the can down the road, that Iran looks like a country that could collapse. And so therefore buying 15 years might not be a bad compromise, right? If that's the best you can do, if that's what you think is the best deal, 15 years, a lot can happen in 15 years.
So I think that concludes our questions for
Great.
your official program, but now we do have a final question since we're finishing a bit early. What is your assessment about the Ukrainian situation?
Well, worse today than it was last week. So here's my basic argument.
So you're like a weatherman, worse today than yesterday.
Here's my take. I don't think Putin wants to invade, but that doesn't mean that he won't. I think Putin made a gross miscalculation. I think, one of the things that political scientists know pretty well is that authoritarian leaders don't understand how democracies work. They don't understand how their decision-making works, and they don't understand why they behave the way they do. So I think if you're Putin and you're looking at the Western alliance, a few months ago, what do you see? You see Brexit, you see the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan, you see Biden, who might look to you like a weak president because of all this domestic policy stuff. You see France mad at the United States and Great Britain over the stuff with the nuclear submarines to Australia. You see a new chancellor in Germany. You see all this stuff and you think the West is weak, they're divided, they're distracted, they're not going to care about Ukraine. What Putin wants is Ukraine to be Finlandized. And Finlandized is a term that refers to the situation of Finland during the Cold War. Finland really would have liked to join NATO, but was prevented because it's right next to the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union basically controlled Finland's foreign policy, but Finland was an independent country. And that's basically what Putin wants. He wants to control Ukrainian foreign policy, but he probably doesn't really want to control Ukraine. He wants Ukraine not to be a member of NATO, and he wants Ukraine not to join the European Union. So I think what he thought was that the West was divided, and that by menacing Ukraine, he could get the things that he wanted. He could get a stable, basically neutral Ukraine, a Finlandized Ukraine, and he was wrong. Here's the problem, right? I think Biden has actually done a pretty good job responding. He's pulled NATO together, he's unified NATO, and he's maintained a pretty solid message. The problem is that by doing that, he's actually done the opposite of what Putin wanted, which is made tighter connections between the European states and the Ukrainians, which might have been the right thing to do, but is actually the opposite of what Putin wants, right? So now the question is, does Putin feel that the only way to get what he wants is to invade? And it actually might be that now he thinks that that's the only way to get what he wants. He knows that the United States is not going to get involved militarily, right? Nobody thinks the United States is, and almost nobody thinks the United States should. So the question is, can the US credibly threaten enough economic punishment to prevent him from doing this? Possibly. The big thing is this pipeline. There's a pipeline that the Russians are building to Germany called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The Germans were really hesitant to sort of put that on the chopping block, but Biden did. That would be a huge blow to Russia. And I think that if he invades, they're going to lose that, which would be devastating. So the question is now at this point, can Putin see ways to get what he wants without invading? I actually think Biden's comment at one point, Biden made a comment about sort of, if you invade, we're going to put devastating sanctions on you. But if you only do something small, right, if you only do something small, we're only going to put small sanctions on you. And people got really mad at him and he said that was a mistake. He didn't mean it. He walked it back. I actually think that was actually very smart. I think at this point, what you want Putin to do is to think that he can accomplish his, right? So Putin has to get something that's close to what he wants out of the situation, and B, save face. So if that's like a cyber attack, if that's something like maybe putting some troops into the eastern area, the Donbass, where Russian troops are already operating, at some point, I think there's a lot of possibilities. The question is, does Putin think that he can get what he wants without a full-scale invasion? I think a full-scale invasion is really, really bad for Putin in a lot of ways. I don't think he wants that. Again, you've got to leave him some outs though, right? You've got to leave him the ability to get what he wants in other kinds of ways. And I don't think it's a mistake that Biden did this, because Biden is also thinking about NATO and all sorts of other things. But I think Biden's response and the West's response has seemed to sort of close those options for Putin and limit what he thinks he can get away with. So my guess is, I would say, I still don't think Putin is going to full invade the country, but I'm not as confident in that as I was last week. I think what's more likely, you're going to see, I think there's a couple possibilities. You might see some sort of secret deal where Ukraine promises not to join NATO or the European Union, but they keep it secret. You might see a deal over American missile defenses in Poland. Putin is really upset about those. Question is, what's Biden willing to give? And that I don't really know, because I'm not the president or one of his advisors. I think there is still room to end this without conflict. The question is the West willing to meet Putin's terms? At the end of the day, right, they don't care all that much about Ukraine, so they're not going to be willing to give up too much, because they don't really care about Ukraine. Ukraine's not a member of NATO. It's not a member of the European Union. So my assessment, it's not good. It's worse than it was last week, but I don't necessarily think that we're at war yet.
Okay, great. So we'll end on that very positive prediction.
Yeah, well, my students always say that, I deal with the worst side of humanity in the world. So,
right.
When you study war, that's just sort of the way it goes.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us here and the Olympia World Affairs Council.
Again, thanks for having me, and thanks so much to everybody for joining me tonight.
Yes, thank you. And just a reminder to everybody, join us next month, the third Thursday. So that's March 17th, same place at this Zoom link at 7:30. We are going to have a conversation with Dr. Parag Hoon from South Puget Sound Community College on the foreign policy in the Biden administration. So we look forward to seeing you all there. And remember, this presentation will be recorded and put up on our website. If there's anyone who you would like to share the link with or want to watch it again yourself, please take a look at our website. Thanks and have a great night.
Good night, y'all. Thank you.